Here's Richard Garner with What in the World on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.
What side are you on? Us versus them. Black or white? All of these things would probably ring true for somebody that's aware of the many polarities that exist in this duality-driven world that we've talked about a lot on this show. But we've talked about it, and like I guess Mark Twain says about the weather, we haven't done anything about it. But tonight, we're going to be joined by somebody who's not only talking about it, he's doing something about it. Scalar Humanity with Tom Clearwater tonight on What in the World? SiriusXM, channel 167.
This is the world calling. Love. I get so lost sometimes.
This is What in the World on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.
And welcome back to the show. It is that time of year again. If you remember last year, we dedicated a few shows to promoting the first year of the Modern Knowledge Tour. Chris Rusak, Dave Whitehead behind that really seminal work here in Canada. I mean, these things happen, conferences happen certainly around North America and have happened for a while, in some cases decades. But in this case, the Modern Knowledge Tour really bringing together thought leaders in multiple different areas to really start to mobilize the people who are out there, I guess, kind of feeling like they're on their own to a degree. A lot of us out there, sort of seeing the world that exists and feeling that sort of niggling, this ain't it. Well, if you've been on that path and you've been sort of studying and reading and watching documentaries and all of those different things, you've arrived at a point where you feel that you have enough information, let's say evidence, that this ain't it. But how do you go to the next level? Modern Knowledge Tour has been, I think, crucial in helping people understand how to come together and also sort of sifting through some of the, non-information, disinformation, and real information. And I think most importantly, bringing a bunch of people together physically to actually connect with each other, old school style, city to city tour versus just simply existing in a chat room. And this year, the tour starts again on the 14th of August and again goes through multiple cities in Canada. And we'll get to those later on. And one of the guests that's going to be part of this year is Tom Clearwater, and that name might be familiar to people that are familiar with Stephen Greer's film and also just generally the ET disclosure movement. They know Tom was a big part of enabling that, facilitating that from behind the scenes. But he's gonna be sort of taking a step forward this year and sharing some of his thoughts from a career academically and professionally that's pretty rare. I mean, Tom, they throw around the term Renaissance man, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I mean, when you go back in your bio and you look at your successful business career, your successful legal practice. But you started off studying, ancient religions and then somehow made this transition. And so you have the ability to speak, I think, in an educated fashion about a lot of different topics. And I think that's going to be really helpful to the people going forward. But just talk about sort of the trajectory that gets you to where you are today.
Well, you're right to say that, I've had a varied backdrop. You might say I'm a generalist, and as a generalist, I didn't really fit the tenor of what was the drive toward kind of increasing specialization in our university system. As a generalist, what I wanted to do, what I fundamentally wanted to understand, is how all the parts, all the pieces fit together. And in order to do that, I had to essentially immerse myself in as large a number of those pieces to be able to grab that larger perspective, to be able to then speak from this perspective of the pattern I saw as from those pieces. But I had to do the work within any of those pieces, so let's say history, philosophy, anthropology, psychology, spirituality, etc., to be able to grasp for my own comfort level, what was the essence of the trajectory within that particular discipline. Then to be able to, with some comfort, knowing that I had done enough work in that regard, to then be able to survey the landscape, as it were, between the various functional disciplines that I found myself immersed in.
And that's super important. And it's interesting. I remember a conversation I had with Dr. Amit Goswami. Do we know, and just generally the quantum physics movement, let's say, of the last few years, this is a guy at Stanford University. This isn't just some, guy in his basement, talking about things he's read on the internet. This is a man who's, dedicated his life, to the study of particle physics and string theory, et cetera, and has come to the conclusions that he came to, similar to your sort of path, not through necessarily having a based opinion that he was working towards. It was really the result of elimination. But one of the things that I remember most about that conversation was, as somebody who isn't in this field, I was always perplexed by the idea of specialization and siloing. You talked about this trajectory of generalization from the outset. And to me, even at the medical level, I could never understand how, the ear, nose, and throat doctor didn't know anything about genes, or didn't know anything about blood, or the blood person didn't know. And because when you look at certainly the body as a holistic thing, you can see clearly that siloing actually prevents you from making better decisions. And then when I asked Dr. Goswami about the sciences, I said, is it just me, or was this done deliberately at some point to sort of put people, put blinders on people and say, okay, you're a chemist, you don't know anything about physics. You're a physicist, you don't know anything about history. You're a historian, you don't. And ultimately, you have all these very narrow opinions. And it seems to me that if we were to start education over again, wouldn't the way you did it be the way to go?
Well, I think if you're speaking in terms of the natural developmental pathway of an individual is going to follow what feels right for that, the particularity that individual embodies. That can only be done on an individual basis, kind of finding what is meaningful for that person in the manner that person requires. And for a lot of people, that will bring in, let's say, a more right brain perspective, which is a connection-making perspective, rather than this kind of fracturing, single-mode educational system. You mentioned medicine and healthcare. Well, the word health means whole, and a whole is basically a patterning of a macro patterning of the parts, and you cannot get to that patterning if you are just sitting within a given partialized field. It's not possible. And so you see from, let's say, news sources about various forms of scientific so-called interventions in people's lives medically, that a lot of these are hitting a wall of failure in important regards. And it's, in my opinion, the reason is that they are missing entirely the relatedness between the various kind of sub-disciplines that they're progressing with.
It's interesting to me because you mentioned pattern, right? And I don't know if this was just a sort of an inherent thing in you that sort of drove this methodology, but it's interesting because when you say that, I envision zooming out, right?
Yes.
So when we're super in something, let's use the Chris Rusak in here shooting. Actually, Chris, what's the in South America, you look down the those. The insect and
Nazca lines?
The Nazca lines, thank you. I remember somebody talking about the Nazca lines, which, have been talked about a lot in, Eric von Daniken's work, that if you were walking, and the reason the Nazca lines were never noticed before were because pre-flight, if you were walking along the flat ground, you wouldn't have noticed the patterns. But once we were able to sort of go skyward and look down at a bigger picture, you were able to notice all these unbelievable images that had been, left there. And that's another conversation for another show. But again, from the standpoint of a narrow or a broader perspective, the ability to sort of zoom out and look at everything, to notice patterns, because isn't at the end of the day, and this is why I'm really excited to talk about Scalar Humanity and all of this, isn't at the end of the day the sort of solution to what this is all about is identifying these patterns and then having the ability to then work with those patterns going forward?
Well, yes, that's an essential component of getting out of the box of what has been this educational kind of straitjacket that people have put on themselves, essentially. It's important to recognize that, yes, each of these disciplines is important in its own respect, but absent that, as you said, view from 50,000 or 100,000 feet, where you can actually see the patterning amongst all the various kind of minutial little parts down below. That patterning is essential as a feedback loop for understanding within any of those disciplines what that discipline might mean in its larger respect, because everything is always working all the time, regardless whether you know it or not. And if you're in a discipline where you are, learning, let's say, X, and you think X is factored by, Y and Z only, you're going to be lost, because all of the other letters of the alphabet are bearing upon X just as much as Y and Z are, even though you're not aware of that. The fact is that everything bears upon everything. And in a holistic point of view, you develop a sensitivity to those kinds of dynamics, learn to back out, pull out of stream of the particular given discipline in question, and then to be sensitive to what might be an influence in this context for this particular discipline or issue that you're dealing with. All of that comes through what I would characterize as the more right brain, out of stream approach that can look down, see the patterning, and see how, let's say, an idea from within a given discipline might be incoherent with the patterning, in order to allow the person to then go in and change that.
Well, it's interesting. We were familiar with the mapping of the human genome a few years back, and how important that was in understanding genes, etc. Most recently, the mapping of the brain. I'm guessing that at some point, for us to be able to sort of prove irrefutably the interconnectedness of life, somebody's going to have to map the interconnections, literally all the nodes, the A, the X, the Y, the Z, and Tom Clearwater might be the person that could get us there, because that map would be, I think, the catalyst for a whole new era of evolution going forward, one of interdependence versus this idea of isolation and separateness. We're going to talk more about that after the break. It is What in the World, SiriusXM channel 167, Canada Talks.
Don't you know, talking about a revolution, it sounds like a whisper while they're standing in the welfare lines, crying at the doorsteps of those armies of salvation, wasting time.
Welcome back to What in the World with Richard Garner on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.
Welcome back to the show. We're with our guest, Tom Clearwater, businessman, academic, entrepreneur, and honestly, the tag Renaissance man works here, at least neo-Renaissance man, for the new world that hopefully we're creating, Tom, and part of generating solutions going forward for a world that is less about separation / polarization and more about interconnection and therefore interdependence. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. We touched on it before the break, but obviously the flip side of a world that is fully understanding its oneness and therefore its interdependence is the world that we're currently living in. A world that is based on duality. Us, them, black, white, very little gray, not much time for the complexity or context of things. That has been, and maybe this is just part of our evolution. And I think you touch on the fact in your work that it could be just an important part of where we are and where we're going to deal with that. But ultimately, you've really dug deep into the idea of not just polarization being a euphemistic term about, I'm a Republican and I'm a Democrat, or I'm conservative, I'm liberal. You're talking about polarization existing at the at the not just metaphysical level, but the actual base of how we're constructed as beings, as a planet, etc. Expand on that with the sort of notion of what scalar humanity means to you.
Right. Let me draw a let's say a twofold picture, and yes, I think the time until now where you have this polarized differentiation, let's say amongst disciplines, amongst people, amongst nations, amongst political parties and whatnot, we can call that a certain level of functioning that is, as you said, intended to put people in opposition to each other, which basically functions as a differentiating modality.
Divide and conquer.
It's divide and conquer, and the one who conquers is the one who sets the policy or the procedures for the next coming time in the area in question and whatnot. Okay, that's one configuration of polarity where it's us versus them, it's me versus you. It's a zero-sum understanding. That is an entropic understanding. It's basically a closed system understanding. The transition that I have become aware of in my own life and within society generally, watching the trends and watching the directions that are being taken by that very system, which is basically a Hegelian me versus you zero-sum system, is toward an internalization of what in the current mode is an externalized form of polarization. So if you take that polarization inside, where instead of there being something outside that completes the polarity with me, I take the polarization internally, I become what is the energy of that polarity. And every pole, you might say, implies its opposite, such that if I have externalized an opposite to a given pole, let's say I'm taking the position that X is right, well, it's what I'm seeking in my external environment is not X. And the energy between us is going to be one because of the externalization of a form of clashing.
So can I speak quickly to the Tom Clearwater from many years ago who's studying ancient religions? Mm-hmm. And when I hear, let's say, your ascended masters, your Hindu mystics, let's say, and the overall idea in that world of the I am, the light, and the dark, etc., right?
Yes.
I am, the alpha and the omega, all of that, which again sounds poetic, sounds, obviously driven from scripture or, in terms of interpreting that myth. But that seems to sound like the science that you're talking about, that this idea that we're one or the other is just simply a zero-sum game, as you say, that everybody is everything. And that's difficult for us to get our heads around, because we don't want to be good and bad. We don't want to be black and white. But if that exists within us, then I guess the sort of logical extension of that is the ability to, once you understand that you are all and that you are both ends of the polarity, I'm guessing the ability to sort of choose how that manifests would be easier going forward.
Well, indeed it does, and there's a subtlety here whereby if you are black and white, whereby black implies white and vice versa, black is not just simply black, and white is not just simply white. There's an old saying from a rabbi, Menachem, I think it was. He says, if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am I, then I am not I, and you are not you. So in a unity perspective, when you pop out of the polarization in the first sense of the term, whereas, I'm a Democrat and you're a Republican, I'm going to oppose you, the opposition, when that is internalized, you become that energy that is that inner polarity. And it is not either of the poles. It is something that is both closed system and open system. And so it's fundamentally a creative energy. Yes, creation on its flip side always implies destruction. In a temporal sense, of what used to be. Some part of what used to be is going to be seen to have been destroyed in any act of creation that moves forward on a line like that. so that to embody both poles means fundamentally to embody either of the poles in any event. Because if you want to be a creative person, you have to embody, and you cannot project outside of your being, destructivity. You have to come to terms with the fact that creation, movement, growth, development, call it what you will, is necessarily an act where something actually really changes. And that word change implies destruction. And so, yeah, it's
birth and death.
Birth and death. It's a process whereby there are always the two poles. And yet, death doesn't mean death as it would mean when it's externalized and you're afraid of it and it's chasing you. It is more along the lines, in my own experience, of completion, where it's as if a line meets itself finally as that line to become a circle. And so the fear drops. The fear is gone. For my part, I virtually have no fear of death. I went through a time in my early life where I was in my late teenage years. I spent 2-3 years just deathly afraid of death. And I dove into that with the kind of typical abandon that I dive into everything. And that fear went away, but it didn't fully resolve until I had come to a point of inner resolution where I had taken it inside me as that thing that I had otherwise pushed out. So essentially what I'm speaking of here by an internalization is that these opposites, when they are inside your person, they operate as a resonance, and you can feel it, such that, and we can segue perhaps into the notion of scalar humanity here, where which is fundamentally a kind of a Tesla idea. Tesla, if you go to Tesla, he spoke all the time of resonance, and it's really, really difficult to kind of understand what was he meaning by resonance, because we typically understand resonance in a typical electromagnetic circuit as between, let's say, a capacitive and an inductive oscillation between the two, etc. That's not what he's speaking about. He is speaking about the resonance of opposition, whereby, let's take the analogy again to creation and destruction. If you want to embody the creative pole and you have internalized the destructive pole, what you will have done there is to have completed the actual notion or reality of creativity inside yourself, because it necessarily implies its opposite. And that marrying between those two is felt internally as a form of resonance. So resonance in the Tesla sense.
And is that potentially a synonym? Could I throw peace in there?
Absolutely, because the modality where you are externalizing one of these poles, whether it's Republicans or death, or you pick any variety, it's basically you're pushing out the least comfortable pole for a given kind of situation. That is always going to feel like you are compromising yourself, because essentially you cannot be one pole and not the other.
You're pushing away an element of yourself.
You're pushing away an element of yourself. So pushing that away, you don't feel very good.
Yeah.
And so, it feels like bloody conflict, which is really what it is.
But in a pleasure-pain society, which we live in, where that's essentially the modality is, seek pleasure and resist pain, push pain away,
yes,
etc. You're always pushing away something. You're always resisting something,
right?
And I guess if you resist it, it persists, and all of that other stuff. But when you sort of compare this and align it with, basic electromagnetic breakdown of it as from a Tesla perspective, you do see this, and it makes a hell of a lot more sense than it would if somebody was trying to just explain the abstraction of all this, because it is quite abstract.
Oh, it's very abstract, yeah, and in fact, it's an abstract leap beyond kind of that previous mode that we were talking about. So it does require a particular kind of development in order to kind of get everything aligned in such a way that that these pieces can come together. And just to refer back to something that you started with, yes, that is fundamentally what enlightenment is. Enlightenment is stopping the projection. Though you don't resist the fact that there is this projection because it's needed for a certain level of growth. It's like that differentiation must take place. But when you're at the level where when you've gone through those developmental phases, sufficient that you're ready to kind of jump up a level of complexity to be able to see the patterning of what you've done, which is to pop out of the stream of that particular activity, there you enter into a space where, okay, it becomes internalized. And in that internalization, what you jump into is a kind of inner coherence, peace, stability, anything that can be associated with the enlightened person who no longer projects something out and no longer refuses to receive something that's coming in. And that enlightenment is a form of Tesla resonance, is a form of inner coherence, which is based on this notion of two poles, opposite in nature, coming into resonance with each other, recognizing each other as being not two, not different.
But one.
But one.
Wow. This is some important stuff going on here tonight on What in the World. I'll tell you that. More with Tom Clearwater after the break. It is What in the World, SiriusXM, Canada Talks, channel 167.
For the daily races, going nowhere, going nowhere. The tears are filling up.
Baby, I'm grieving, but if you wanna leave, take good care. Hope you have a lot of nice things to wear, but then a lot of nice things turn bad out there.
You're listening to What in the World with Richard Garner on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.
Our guest tonight, Tom Clearwater, businessman, academic, future author, I'm guessing, and somebody you're going to be hearing a lot about. And if you've listened to the first part of the show, you're probably aware, as I am, that we're stumbling into some territory here that's potentially revolutionary, because a lot of these different, and ironically, considering what we're talking about, Tom, a lot of people in different silos going at things, whether it be consciousness or Tesla studies or metaphysics or whatever it is, quantum physics, again, possibly repeating the same mistakes that the former, pedagogy type thing was doing, which is, all these silos. And now somebody like yourself comes at all of this from a 60,000 foot perspective and starts to see how this actually connects. And this idea of oneness, at this point, a concept, an idea, is infinitely closer, it seems, when you're talking about this idea of the polarities existing internally. And it takes the whole externalization of everything out of the equation, and you're understanding how somebody could be balanced, let's say, for lack of a better word, at the individual level and at the macro level. I'm guessing all of these things are transferable. You're talking about this with the individual. Clearly, you're talking about this at the macro level, I'm guessing.
Yes, and you're right to say it is revolutionary in the sense that it is a change in the paradigm from what is essentially a linear temporal frame of being or model or understanding into a nonlinear, by which I mean a circle plus line perspective, which has internalized opposition, no longer externalizing, as you said there. So the transition out of linear into nonlinear is a huge transition, and society has in certain kind of small respects thrown a few green shoots up in terms of this new perspective coming, but basically where we are headed is for the tip of the pyramid of humanity to peek through into that nonlinear perspective, which is going to generate a hole in that membrane, as it were, and there's going to be a lot of people coming through as the cumulative effect of this change really starts taking hold in society. And there are all sorts of angles a person could approach this from. You know, you can see in the financial world, which I have been following intensively for the last 10 years at least, you can see the linear system has gone essentially parabolic. So the denied circularity, as it were, within the financial system, which is a linear, accumulative, interest-based system, which exponentially along that line, that line eventually curves upward, and when it curves upward, everything starts coming to pieces because the entire system is heading toward a non-linear transformation of that linear system. It's going into a chaos node when it hits that circularity. That is, in essence, how people develop from within that linear system. And you can see it in all sorts of ways, like people have a midlife crisis. So they press something down in their life. They say, I'm going to work. I'm going to do this. I'm going to, be successful in this manner of career. And they press all sorts of things down. Well, none of that stuff disappears. Anything that's repressed, because we are in fact not entropic systems, but we are in fact negentropic. We are over unity systems. We are here. We are the evidence of over unity itself by simply the fact of our existence. Whenever you repress something, it's down there gaining a little more energy, and people know this from their experience. If I feel angry and I repress it, it's like the next time that comes out, it's going to be, the X amount of anger I previously experienced plus one.
Hence the disproportionate
right, and so
nature
people,
of it. Yeah.
That's right. If you got a lot of pressure that you push that anger down every time, it's going to come up parabolically someday, and you're going to go postal. Well, that's just linear process going into a non-linear mode. Eventually, the circularity pushes through and comes in as the kind of over unity energy that has built up and is going to drive a hole through that pressure point that you've been placing upon it.
What does that look like to you? I mean, I'm not asking for projections on time necessarily. We don't need to be in the prediction business on 10 years, 20 years, or whatever. But what does that? Because it sounds like it's once you've mapped out, the process of the methodology and sort of tested it, as you have, sort of holding it up against multiple examples, macro, micro around the world, then obviously we're talking about an inevitability, right? There is a best before date on this.
Yes, absolutely.
So what does this look like then to you? How does this manifest between the next, say, birth and death of this society we call, Earth here, with all the human beings running around?
Right, sure, good question. If you look in history, you can see that that the leading edge in society is typically filled from science. And this is because there are so many resources poured into science, because science can build weapons, and weapons can keep the evil people away, etc. That has been the historical pattern. And so back in the early 1900s, you had the emergence of two nonlinear scientific disciplines. One was quantum physics, the other was Tesla science. Now, both were repressed. Not quantum physics so much as Tesla science, but in fact both were repressed. So we've had well over 100 years of that pressure bearing down upon this emergent change, which peaked into manifestation in the human society back in 1900, when Max Planck understood that there's a quanta associated with any manner of change, and when Tesla tripped over a discovery that eventually changed his entire understanding. That was approximately 1900. Since that time, due to various factors, including the destructivity of this new nonlinear point of view, which, because it's nonlinear and is holistic, is taking both right brain and left brain, if I can put it that way again, and using both in their synergy, you not only have the extra half of, let's say, your brain operating, you get the synergy. So it's way more than twice as powerful. If you compare, for instance, quantum physics to Newtonian physics, you're looking at a magnitudinal leap in power. And because, for instance, society wasn't quite ready at that point with these physicists leading the cutting edge, bringing that into society because society wasn't ready. There was a necessary repression of, and particularly Tesla technology, because Tesla technology is relatively simple when it comes down to it. But we've had a repression for 100 years. So I would say, with the internet having basically unplugged some of those plugs in the dam, that, and if you look at the nature of parabolic climb, most of the activity on a chart that goes parabolic takes place in the last 3 to 4%, and we're in that last 3 to 4%. So
is that why it feels? I mean, I know this sounds like maybe an idiotic question and oversimplification, but I really absolutely feel that time is accelerating right now.
Oh yeah, absolutely, because the meaningful change of relations, which is our subjective experience of time, has become sequentially much greater in a given so-called unit of clock time on the wall. So the experiential amount of change in a given minute is much higher now.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly feels like. Are you a singularity person? I don't so much mean Kurzweil's singularity. I more mean Terence McKenna's singularity. Do you believe this is all sort of coming to one particular point? In a certain respect, yes. Part of me says yes. Part of me says no, and I'll define what I mean by both. Yes, in the sense that whenever you have a change, like for instance from linear to nonlinear, that's a binary leap. Like nonlinear virtually has nothing to do with linear. There are process determinants that enter into kind of what linear used to be is now nonlinear, but the actual field is so fundamentally different. I've used the analogy in the past that the actual experience of going into nonlinear is you've never seen above the surface of water, and you come from the ocean's depth, and very, very slowly you're coming up, and pretty soon it's starting to get a little lighter. And it gets a little lighter, but then there comes that point where you break the surface. That's huge. Compared to everything you had experienced previously, the world is completely different. So in terms of the actual transformation, in terms of what we're doing, yes. In terms of what needs to be kind of seeded into society so that people don't starve because the economy falls flat, because we're entering into everything changes. The whole economy is going to change. Our finance system is going to change. We're not built for that level of quantum leap evolution, I'm guessing.
Yes, we're not. Societally, we need some time to be able to pattern it out from that change that will actually occur interiorly inside people first.
Would you guess, I would guess then that whoever the people that say quote unquote on the other side of things, who people might surmise, are controlling things, might be, in their defense, and I don't mean I'm defending them, but their justification might be that we're not, yes, the information for disclosure is out there, yes, it is whatever, but unfortunately, we can't take such a massive, singular change at one time. It needs to be sort of seeded in. I wouldn't be surprised if that would be the defense. We'll talk a little bit about that on the other side of the break. And finish up on Modern Knowledge Tour. It is What in the World, SiriusXM, channel 167.
Things are gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter. Someday, yeah, we'll put it together and we'll get it undone.
When time stood still, eagle flew out of the night. He was something to observe. Came in close, I heard a voice.
This is What in the World on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.
So welcome back. It's our last segment with Tom Clearwater, and we'll talk a little bit about Tom's role in Modern Knowledge Tour. And certainly if you're in Canada and the ability to attend in person, should be pretty exciting. We're going to get the dates. Chris is going to actually jump in with us and sort of give you a lowdown of what to expect as well. Tom's going to be speaking at one of the events, Tom, or multiple events?
Just one event in Toronto.
In Toronto. But as far as our conversation today, and I'm hoping future conversations, to say I don't say this a lot would be easily supported, because we could go back and check the audio evidence. But I really think that I'm sitting in front of somebody that might have really cracked a nut here, and that's, I guess, an unsophisticated way of saying that it's rare that you really feel that there are breakthroughs that are tangible and ultimately something that can catalyze a tipping point, a shift, a paradigm shift. We talked about this earlier. Whatever it is that you're doing, Tom, in this field really seems to me something that is bringing together a bunch of different things that people have been looking at and studying in silos, and maybe crystallized it in a way that is that necessary ingredient for us to be able to truly evolve consciously, according to the real laws of the universe, which are probably closer to what you're talking about versus the kindergarten level that we've been operating at in this sort of us versus them duality and separation and all these other things. Matter is the only evidence, etc. All of these things that are coming closer and closer to their best before date. Having said all of that, what then do you do with this work going forward? Because I would say that there's a responsibility then for you to sort of go out and start not just synthesizing the work, which I'm guessing you're going to continue to do, but now communicating it and sort of spreading the word.
Right. I think you're right. The what people need from, let's say, someone like me who has done the kind of examination I've done over time, and it's been a long time. I was in university for, including law school, for something like 13 years, chasing kind of fundamental questions I had about the universe. I didn't care what the curriculum was. I just took courses as I saw fit to answer those questions. I'm quite an intense personality, so everything I've done has always been with the gas pedal pushed to the floor. And yes, it has seen results in my own life, in my own experience, and in terms of the what is to me the evident explanatory power of this polarity view, this viewpoint from the nonlinear framework. And there are ways that this can be presented to people that I can foresee that can be helpful to them in terms of their kind of more closely aligning themselves with that direction that they are inevitably being taken by their own very process. So I look forward to doing that. It has been a long journey for me. It's been a long, kind of intensive, experiential and academic and practical journey to come to this point of view that has only in the last couple of years started coming together in a big way.
Well, certainly one of the places you're going to be able to start sort of spreading the gospel, so to speak, will be the Modern Knowledge Tour. Chris is going to jump in here quick. Chris Rusak in the house, as the kids maybe once said. Chris, give us the sort of lowdown on the Modern Knowledge Tour, when, where, tickets, etc.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here again, and we really appreciate the support that you've been giving us. And
Our pleasure.
Awesome. So it's going to be a 5-event tour this August 2015. We're going to be starting off in Montreal on August 15th, followed the next day in Toronto on August 16th with Tom Clearwater as one of our featured speakers. Then we're off to Calgary the following weekend, August 22nd, and then back-to-back on the West Coast, August 29th in Vancouver, and August 30th, wrapping up in beautiful Victoria, British Columbia.
And give us some returning guests from I think Dr. Carmen Bolter's there with some really exciting surprise announcements that are gonna rock your world, and some other people. But give us an idea of some returning guests as well as some of the new voices.
Yeah, you're correct. Dr. Carmen Bolter will be returning. She'll be doing 2 dates with us on the West Coast. And she will be talking about some new discoveries she's made down in Egypt.
Crazy stuff, man.
It is. It's exciting. And it was a pleasure to do a really intense interview with her that you can find online on our website as well.
The only kind she does.
Yes, yes. And so not only are we featuring Tom Clearwater in our Toronto event, he'll be joined by visionary artist Alex Gray. Him and his wife Allison will be flying up from New York City from Cosm, Chapel of Sacred Mirrors, and he will be delivering a talk on how art affects consciousness or creates consciousness. So Tom will be speaking alongside Alex and Allison in Toronto. We also have, which David White and I think is a hidden gem of the tour, is Marty Leeds. Marty Leeds is a numerologist who looks at, basically he's the pie man. He looks at numbers as aspects of the universe. There's information buried in numbers, kind of along the same parallel lines of what Tom's talking about. The universe has different ways to reflect information back at us. And Marty's going to be presenting the deconstruction of the English alphabet through numerology. It's a great journey Marty will take you on. It's very easy to comprehend, so don't let the numbers thing scare you.
Yeah.
If you're not a mathematician yourself, you're really going to enjoy that presentation. And also, too, our big featured guest on all 5 tour stops is Nassim Haramein. Nassim's going to be flying in from the Resonance Project out in Hawaii, and he's going to be joining us on all 5 Canadian events this August.
And I would put him in the same category as what we were talking about with Tom. Obviously, Nassim Haramein, a guest to the show, one of our more memorable interviews here on What in the World. But again, somebody who's, there's some people out there that are doing great work, but there's some people that are closer to cracking a nut and actually and on the mainstream side, which is key. Nassim Haramein's work has been received. It's been repressed a little bit, but it certainly has been recognized on the mainstream side. And on that note, before we let you go, Tom, is that because I'm guessing, we talked about, Modern Knowledge Tour and going out and speaking to, let's just say this, preaching to the choir, X amount of people who are already there, or not already there, but you know what I mean, who are open to these ideas. How do you crack the other side of the equation and or is it necessary to be published in Nature or Scientific American, etc.?
No, I don't think it's necessary. I think in the future people are going to very well find their own means of understanding what they need to understand in the way they need to do it, and that will be aided by the internet, by all sorts of different kinds of relations that will spring up outside of the typical kind of, let's say, scientific peer-reviewed kind of nature. I don't see any necessary structuring that needs to take place. That structuring will come organically.
So you have full trust in the new communication systems, and you don't believe, as some do, that we need to overthrow the establishments for these things to be quote unquote heard or for them to manifest?
No, I don't think so. They're going to be overthrown by the very processes they're engaging. So, you mentioned, for instance, that, there is a faction in society that wants to keep anything new at bay. They want to basically hold it down. Well, that's just going to create extra pressure for it to pop out. When it pops out, it's going to pop out higher. So you can thank them actually for that service, because it's a necessary part of the propulsion needed to push as high as we possibly can to get into that new sector.
Wow. For those of you at home who are pessimistic and angry and hopeless, if that didn't give you some degree of energy to sort of reinvigorate your pursuit, your path, your seeking of the truth, I don't know what will. Great stuff today, Tom. And again, I really think this is the type of stuff that historically we're going to look back on as really a catalyst in a tipping point that is probably long overdue. Looking forward to hearing you in Toronto, part of the Modern Knowledge Tour. Thanks to Chris Rusak. We'll have another guest next week and continue to give you more information about the Modern Knowledge Tour, how you can participate in that. The website is modernknowledge.ca. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week on What in the World. SiriusXM Canada Talks 167.